Hi, everybody. Welcome back to part two of our lecture for week three. And again, I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there due to the problems with the starter for my car. Like I said before, I'm still hoping it will be fixed today or tomorrow. In any event, I will be there. I can borrow a car from a friend I've discovered not in time to get there on Tuesday, but after I posted on Facebook saying, oh, trapped. I had a couple of people who said if I still need one next week, I can borrow one. So one way or another, I will be there. But we talked about the book of Acts in the last video. I did want to highlight once again this book called the Acts of the Apostles. It's from a series. That's what this word or this phrase at the top means, Sacra Pagina, sacred pages. And it's by a guy named Luke Timothy Johnson. And Luke Timothy Johnson was my professor of New Testament and Jesus studies when I was an undergrad at IU. I got a bachelor's degree in religious studies from them 35 years ago. So he was one of my professors back then, one of my favorite professors. This book was written probably about 20 years after I had him as a professor. But notice it is rather thick. This is what's called a biblical commentary. And this is the series that it's part of. There is a book of this series for each of the books in the New Testament. And not all of them are this thick because Acts is actually a fairly thick book in and of itself. But essentially what it does is it goes through pericope by pericope. Now, what does pericope mean? It's not going through verse by verse, and it's not going through chapter by chapter. It's going through sort of story by story. And so it'll talk about the story, and then it'll break the stories into the different verses if necessary. But those stories are often called pericopes. And if you look at it typed out in words, it looks like pericope, like periscope without the S, but it's pronounced pericope. And that is, in fact, how this is organized. So it will sort of go through and look at, like here, we have Peter's Pentecost sermon. And then on this page, it's showing you the text of that sermon. And then on the following pages, it will go through different details about that so that you can get a fuller understanding. And it'll bring in some details from other commentaries as well. There are several different commentary series. I have, for the book of Acts, the interpretation series. I have the New Interpreter's Bible series. For both of those, I have a lot or all of the commentaries. I don't have all of the books of the Bible in interpreters or in Sacra Pagina or in the Hebrew scripture side. It's called Berit Olom. But I do have all the New Interpreters volumes, and I have several other volumes along the way. That's what's important when you're looking at different series and different interpretations. Get different voices. Get different, not voices in your head, but get different voices that talk about the text. That way you can say, well, they thought this, but they thought that. And then you can put things together in your own life and in your own mind. One of the other books I want to highlight from Luke and Acts is actually called, let's see, can we get it on screen here? Oh, it doesn't like the Preaching Luke Acts. There we go. It's mostly showing up here by a guy named Ronald J. Allen. And Ron Allen is a friend of mine who was one of my professors in seminary. So this goes back about 20 years ago rather than 35 years ago with Luke Timothy Johnson. This is, as you can see, a much shorter book, a much friendlier book in terms of actually getting through. What this will do is also go through and look at the different themes. Remember when we were looking at the different themes on the PowerPoint, the different themes that are in the book of Acts and how you can draw those out in different ways. Like chapter 3, I just opened it at random to chapter 3, preaching on the realm of God. And it talks about that as a theme that happens in Judaism, a theme as it happens in the journey. We've talked about journeying in both Luke and in Acts as being important, and looks at the different kinds of ways in which the story, both in Luke and Acts, will talk about how you can then understand that theme. And there are several different ones in this book along the way, which include preaching on the Holy Spirit, preaching on the great reunion of the human community, preaching on the restoration of women. Remember, we've talked about the role of the patriarchy in the New Testament texts. Preaching on poverty, abundance, and the use of material resources. Boy, can that be used in the world today. So here's the thing. You can get this book. Hey, it's showing up. On our green screen. You can get this book for about $6 right now. I just checked on Amazon for you. So you can get it used for about $6. You can get it new for about $15 or so. Another book I wanted to highlight for you, going back to our Gospels and also going back to Have I Had This Guy as a Professor? The Real Jesus, Luke Timothy Johnson. This is the same guy who wrote the other commentary, the Sacropagina one. Again, this is a much shorter one. There is a thing out there called the Jesus Seminar, less prominent today than it was a couple of decades ago, but they were looking at the historicity of Jesus and trying to make pronouncements about what's historically accurate and what may not be. And Luke Timothy Johnson sort of takes them to task in different ways and highlights what he considers to be the real way in which we appropriately think about Jesus. And you may or may not agree with him. This book also is something you can get used. I think I found it online for about $2. So if you're interested in that, this would be a good thing to read as well to deepen your understanding of the different ways in which people think about Jesus. And just as Jesus is one of those figures that has a lot of different people thinking in a lot of different ways, Paul is also that kind of person. And this is a book called The Paul Quest. And again, I checked on Amazon, and right now used copies are going for about $3. Again, not nearly as thick as Sacropagina, thicker than the other two that I just showed you, but you might notice the name of the author, Ben Witherington III. He's the author for the textbook we're using in this class. So this is a discussion of, again, looking at the history, looking at the way in which Christians have looked at Paul over the course of 2,000 years, looking at the documentary evidence, looking at other ways in which we interpret what we're doing. So I can recommend this book as well. And then A.N. Wilson wrote this book, The Mind of the Apostle Paul. Oh, let's see, can we get it? It's rather like our stained glass window, so it's sort of fading into the background. Here as well. So I can recommend this book as well. The stained glass window behind us, by the way, in the virtual background here, is a stained glass window of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. And if I sort of get out of the way here, you'll see a horse down below. There are many depictions of him being sort of knocked off his horse. That's an interesting interpretation thing too. And when we get to talking about his conversion, which happens in the book of Acts, but he references it, and so we can see what's happening there. He doesn't go into the full story the way it is in Acts, but there are different kinds of tags back to it. And he will talk about himself as being not one of the original 12 apostles, and that becomes significant. So let me see if I can share the screen again, and we will see if that works this time for us. Okay, it looks like it is working for us. And let's see, can I get us back to full screen? Yes. And I will get us up to Paul's letters. Paul is a controversial figure in early Christianity and continues to be in some ways in modern Christianity. He was born in a city called Tarsus, which was a major city, not a sort of New York City kind of major city, but a sort of a second tier city. He moved to Jerusalem. He studied in the temple. This tells us that he's got some upper crusty connections along the way. The first we hear of him, he is persecuting the church. And later he has a dramatic conversion and begins his travels. He travels back and forth from Jerusalem to different parts of the Eastern Roman Empire, mostly sticking with the places where Greek is the dominant second language, if not the dominant first language. He doesn't make it all the way to Spain and Gaul, which we call France today, and although he certainly had plans to do that, but he did not in fact get there. Many Bibles that you pick up will have a map in them that will show Paul's journeys in different ways. There's sometimes a little bit of back and forth dotted lines where we're not quite sure of some of the sequences of the trips. But for the most part, we're clear that he did go to Jerusalem several different times. He paid some visits to some key cities. He wrote letters. We have a feeling we're missing some letters, not necessarily from Paul, but to Paul. And I'll talk about that as we go through here as well. Paul was a Jew first and foremost. I'm not a big fan of this pyramid thing here because it puts Christian on top. It depends on what you're emphasizing as to where we put these different things. But he was born a Jew and he never stopped being one. I think that's an important thing for us to remember when we're talking about him. He didn't go from Saul the Jew to Paul the Christian. That is not the way it works. The Saul Paul kind of thing is more of a linguistic thing. It's not the what happened when he was converted kind of thing. So I don't really like this pyramid here, but I get why the textbook might have this, because these are three different parts of his identity. I also don't like it because it sort of smacks of Trinitarianism, and I'm a Trinitarian person, but not where Paul is concerned. That's a sort of inappropriate structure to put onto Paul. But he was, by the end of his life, in fact, all three of these things all at once. He has different parts to him, and we can see those in Acts, and we can see those in his letters. In terms of being a Roman, he never mentions it really himself, but it's mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. When we say, well, why did he never mention it in his letters? His letters were really insider stuff. He was not envisioning that people outside of Christianity would be laboring over his letters, most likely, and saying, aha, he never mentioned this, therefore. So he also didn't want to use his being a Roman citizen as something like, well, now you have to follow me because I'm part of the dominant culture. That's actually not the way Christianity operated in the early years of the church, and didn't operate that way for hundreds of years until it became the official religion of the empire. And we still sort of have a problem with that, all the way up to the Reformations and later. When you make a religion something that you have to follow because that's what the state's telling you, there's a problem with that, because that's not by faith alone. That's by the power of the state. And that's actually rather much against the idea of what it means to be a free Christian or a free practitioner of any one of them. When we're looking at Paul, who is Jewish, he talks about himself as being Jewish. He talks about himself as being a follower of the Mosaic law. He wants to show that Jesus comes from that tradition, as the prophets had spoken. And he also calls himself a Pharisee. So when there is the sectarian problems with the Sadducees and Pharisees, as we talked a little bit about in class in our first week, he lines up with the Pharisees along the way, which is interesting because typically the modern Christian will hear the word Pharisee and think something negative. But remember, we're reading something that was really an internal family discussion and family debate, and making it as outsiders something that it sometimes really shouldn't be. So one of the things that we see leveled against Paul as a Jewish person is that he was someone who then abandoned the faith. He would not have would not have agreed with that along the way. And in terms of being a Christian, again, there were people in the movement back then who really worried about this guy. They worried about this guy because this guy was a persecutor. And is he just becoming an insider? Is he a double agent? Is he going to turn on us at some point? And he had zeal for the Mosaic law, as they say. And this is, in fact, something that becomes a bit of a problem for how he's perceived later. But he does in his own terms, say he emulates Christ, he suffered for Christ, he shows some different manifestations that he would like to be have held up as being part of his identity and mission and confirmation of, as such. He saw himself in many different ways. At one point, he frankly says he's trying to be all things to all people as much as possible. There are lots of ministers and pastors who try that too. Burnout is a real thing, and we can see perhaps some of that happening occasionally in Paul as well. But he was someone who was a servant and put most of his efforts towards being a servant in different ways. Even when he was a teacher and a theologian and a missionary and an evangelist, these were always done in the context of his being a servant in one way or another. He was multilingual. He was someone who could read the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew. He was someone who spoke Greek fairly well. He was someone who could write in Greek fairly well. He was someone who could read and write probably in Aramaic and perhaps in Latin as well. He seemed to have sort of frenetic energy, and he was always on the go. And he was someone who could stand up in front of people and talk forever, and hold them in sort of enraptured in many ways. So that becomes an interesting thing as well, because I know people who can talk forever, and you don't really want to sit there for a long time. So Paul had that gift along the way. He was great at rhetoric. And when we're talking about rhetoric, this is a skill. And sometimes we look at different leaders. For example, Ronald Reagan was considered to be the great communicator. If you're old enough like me to remember Ronald Reagan as a president, even the people who didn't like his policies and didn't tend to like him would give him credit for being a great rhetorician, yes, great speaker. He was someone who knew how, and that was partly his Hollywood upbringing. He knew how to work a crowd, and he knew how to work the camera, and that's something that sometimes politicians lack. One of the things that Bill Clinton, for example, was always credited for was being someone who could walk into a room and have everyone, even often his enemies, liking the guy. On the other hand, you get some people who are very sort of deliberative and very sort of very sort of stolid and stagey kind of thing. I'm thinking Gerald Ford, for example. He was not a great speaker. He would freely admit that. People around him who even liked him would admit that, and yet he got the job done. And that's the important thing along the way. There are different ways in which you do things, and there are different ways that rhetoric functioned in the ancient world. And they're sometimes a little bit different from the way things work today, except we still have logical arguments, sort of talk from A to B to C to D. If you look at someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a scientist and astronomer today, and I think I've mentioned him in our class before, a lot of the things that he says tend to be logical arguments. Although one of the things that will happen when you're watching him is you will figure out he has a particular persona and character, and he will not shy away from making the occasional emotional appeal. Whereas there are some people who are almost entirely emotional. And there are lots of things that happen and can happen negatively when you sort of go full tilt emotional, because then you're leaving out some important elements of things. And then there are others who it's on the basis of their character and authority. And one of the things that is happening in politics today is there is often a disconnect between these things. And that's where politicians often get into trouble with. If you're trying to unite people, but you're disconnecting on these, you're probably not going to unite people. And that's true whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, whatever, along the way. So we have different parts of rhetoric that are important, especially in the ancient world. People would have been looking for these. And remember, most of the letters that are written in the ancient world, like Paul's letters and Peter's letters and others, were in fact speeches that were meant to be read out loud. People weren't going to take them back home after they're being photocopied and read them. These were things that were meant to have facts and a thesis statement. Why am I telling you this? And arguments that go along with that. But before all of that, you want to sort of open things. Hi, welcome. I'm glad to see all of my friends here today. Thank you, Lydia, for letting us share your home, those kinds of things. And then, of course, we have, after the arguments, objections. Well, why should we do this when all of the people are saying that's the thing? Well, here's why. You answer preemptively objections. And then you have a closing emotional appeal. Charities will do this a lot. You'll see an emotional appeal after they tell you what it is they're trying to do and what it is they want you to help them with. They will then close with an emotional appeal. They'll show you someone that you're going to help. I remember I went to a Habitat for Humanity fundraiser recently, and after welcoming us and establishing rapport, we're all here to help people. They would give us the facts. They would tell us how many homeless people are in America, how many homeless people are in Indiana, how many homeless people are in Bloomington. Their thesis statement is, we can do something about this. And then they gave some examples and some arguments about what we can do and why it's important to do that. They answered some objections to that. Well, if you give people houses, they're just going to be lazy and they're just going to be, no. And then the closing emotional appeal. They brought people in who had been helped. They were following the rules of rhetoric. They were following these 2,000-year-old arguments, processes. These are older than 2,000 years, actually, and it still works. It still works to these days. So when we're looking at what happens in terms of Paul's writing, we see that there are different kinds of things that are done, that some things work and some things don't work in terms of what's happening with regard to it. And our textbook goes into a lot of this stuff here. So I'm going to let you read on these different parts that work and parts that don't work with regards to that. When we see the word apostle, there are different ways in which the word apostle tends to be used. For one thing, apostle is not necessarily equivalent strictly with like the big 12 who were originally called, because Paul becomes the apostle Paul as well. When we think about Mary Magdalene, there is a Latin phrase that's sometimes used, apostoli apostolorum. She's the apostle to the apostles. She's someone who was told by Jesus, go and tell, and she went and told. That's what an apostle is in many ways. And most of the apostles, both Paul and the other 12 and others along the way, are people who traveled out on missions, and they became church planters, and they became people who brought the different parts of Christianity. And being an apostle wasn't necessarily restricted to this early time. St. Patrick was called the apostle to the Irish. That was hundreds of years later, but they hadn't received this message yet. There are apostles to the Slavs, and there are apostles to other groups along the way who come along later. So apostleship is one of those somewhat malleable terms. Paul proclaims himself an apostle. And again, this is a little bit controversial in the early church, because who is he to call himself an apostle? He wasn't with us when, kind of thing. But he says, by the will of God, for the service of God. And this was something that he did, not something that he was. And he, as a fellow worker, was trying to use this title to say that it's not something that he is empowered to do, but he is using the power of God through him to proclaim what's going on there. So that's where this authority becomes, and authority is an issue. Authority in a church, authority in a school, authority in a classroom, authority in a family, authority in a lot of different ways. Who has the right to say what? Who has the right to make decisions? Who has the right to interpret? Who has the right to say, okay, well, this is what you do and not that? So when Paul was thinking about this, he talked about his authority being delegated. This is something that came on him. It's not something that he generated from within himself. He would frequently go down to saying, I'm not trying to pull rank here, and I'm not trying. Sometimes he does it, and maybe a little bit. Yeah, it's like, yeah, right. Because there's at least one time when he's wanting to free the slave Onesimus, for example. He's like, well, I could tell you that you should free him because I'm the Apostle Paul, but I'm going to rely on your good judgment to see that that's what you should do anyway. So yeah, there's an issue there, and I think he does it again, going back to that rhetoric stuff, in an important way, so that he's not pulling rank, but he's reminding one of that along the way. And one of the things that we also see is that he, as he's going through doing what he's doing, and this might be something also for certain people in modern Christianity to reflect upon, he doesn't ask for his followers to give him millions and millions of dollars. Sometimes he doesn't even ask for them to put him up. He goes to work and does his tent making. We sometimes call people who do ministry and do ministry essentially for free on the side of something else, tent maker pastors, tent maker ministers, because that's one of the things that Paul did. He would go to wherever he was going and set up shop in the marketplace and make his living doing that, and do Christianity do Christianity preaching and ministry and other kinds of things off to the side of this, rather than this is what he does for a living. When we look at the different books in the New Testament, we see that they can be grouped in different ways, and they're not put in order in the New Testament in the order in which they would fit if we're sort of putting them together chronologically. So be aware that the order in the Bible does not fit necessarily chronologically the way things are coming through. For example, if you sort of pick up your Bible, I will pick up my Bible down here, and we go to the book of Acts, and we turn from the book of Acts. What is the very next book? Who knows? Waiting. It's Romans. Hey, but look on our screen here. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 down. So why is Romans the next one right after Acts? Well, largely it's because of size, and also because of the message inside of it. Romans is a longer letter with a broader message than some of these. Some of these letters are actually pretty short, and some of them seem to have sort of one key idea. Romans, it's a kind of a tour de force. And then, of course, after Romans, we have other longer letters, and then we get into the shorter letters after that. I'm going to just do a couple of letters here so that you can sort of get a taste of them. When we're talking about Galatians, for example, typically Paul would write after having visited, but not necessarily. That's not always the case. So perhaps I shouldn't say typically. I would say often rather than typically. He would write after having visited. So the letter to the Galatians is written to the people in Galatia. The letter to the Ephesians is written to the people in Ephesus. The Corinthians to the people in Corinth, for example. So often there is a particular hook to the letter. Why is he writing this? One of the things that he was finding was that after he had been there, maybe even while he was there were a group of people who were speaking another type of gospel. And there were some, and I mentioned this before in our class, there were some who thought you had to become Jewish before you could become Christian. And one of the things that would become a stopper was, if you want to become Jewish as a male, you have to be circumcised. And there were some who didn't want to do this. And this becomes what we sometimes call works righteousness. You can't do this unless you do this good work, or unless you do this particular thing along the way. But it wasn't just that, it was also being stricter in Sabbath observance and in the kosher diet. And especially if you're outside of the community of Judea and Jerusalem and the rest of what we would consider Israel today, that's an actually hard thing to do. So what Paul was saying was that there's some people who, by birth and by choice of honoring that birth right, they become part of Judaism and can still be Christians within that context. But there are others who are outside of that, who by faith have elected to be part of the Christian community. And this does not require the hallmarks of Judaism. So one of the things that we see is there are different parts of the letter that are highlighting some key issues. Every one of the letters in the New Testament, at some point, someone had to say, yes, this is real, or no, this is not. Galatians is one of the ones that really never, in our experience as modern scholars, have seen anything that cast a doubt on whether Paul wrote this along the way. It would seem to fit with different things that we're told in the book of Acts, as well as things that are happening in the other letters along the way. So there are pieces of the autobiography of Paul that we glean from different letters. So one of the things that we see is there's some personal stuff in this one that gives us some insights as to who he is. One of the things that we should be careful about is he's not contrasting faith and all the works, or faith and all the law along the way. One of the things we sort of see is that there's a blending that's there, and we shouldn't sort of pick apart things. In the letter of James, I know I'm jumping ahead as our screen says, there is the phrase, faith without works is dead. Paul would say works without faith are also dead. But the thing is, it's not the works that become important. Faith is the important thing, but faith will be shown in different ways. And one of the things that we need to be careful about is we can't sort of piecemeal our way to salvation. We can't piecemeal our way, say, well, I didn't break this law today, and I didn't break this law today, and I didn't break this law today, therefore I must be a good person. It's like, that's not quite the way it works there. Romans, of course, this is a major work, as I mentioned. It's the first one right after Acts, and here's a good quote from Martin Luther, one of the key Reformation leaders. I'm sure you recognize the name. This epistle, we sometimes call the letters epistles, is the chief book of the New Testament, the purest gospel. Notice he's using the word gospel here to refer to a letter. This is in some ways a good news. It's not a story about Jesus' life. That's not what gospel means, although that's how we often use it here. It deserves not only to be known word for word by every Christian, but to be the subject of his meditation, let's say, or her meditation, day by day, the daily bread of her or his soul. Along the way. This is a letter that is written before he goes to Rome. So as I mentioned before, often they are written after, but this is written before. He's putting Jewish and Gentile Christians here on better terms with each other and an equal footing. We see God's righteousness in different ways. He is, in fact, looking to save people, not condemn people. There are condemnations in here, but one of the things, notice the sequence here. We have the condemnations, but then we have the savings that are happening here. So we might have some, oh dear, but then we come up to, okay, this is what you need to do. And it's something that is an historical process, and it is something that is a communal process. So the law in and of itself can't save you, because we're all going to fall short. And in fact, you may remember from lecture 1, there aren't just 10 commandments, there's 613 thou shalts and thou shalt nots. There are 365 negative commandments. Thou shalt not is a negative commandment. one for every day of the year. That's how I remember it. There are 248 positive commandments. Thou shalt honor thy mother and father, something that you should do. 2 times 4 equals 8. That's how I remember that one. So put those together, it's 613. There's no way we're not going to fall short somewhere along the way. And even if we did, all we're doing is fixing our life in a Rubik's Cube. That's not the way that it works. So one of the things that we try to do is we look for the grace of God. The law is something that is important. It tells us what's right and what's wrong in many ways, but it isn't, according to Paul in Romans, the key to salvation. The law in and of itself is, and the way it, especially those who go at it in a mechanistic kind of way, is not the way it's going to work for a salvation. And it's not up to us. It is the result of what God does, and what God does is for Jews and Gentiles alike. So what we have in the book of Romans is we have our weaknesses exposed. We have the power of God revealed to us. We have the presence of sin, but the presence of God to counteract that along the way. So one of the problems, of course, is that there was the idea, well, only the people of Israel are the people who are called to all of this. And he says, well, not everyone who was in that particular place at that particular time, that's not really all that we're talking about here. If Jesus has a divine sovereignty, if he's Lord of all, then in fact we're all part of that along the way. And some of what I'm saying actually is reflected in other writings as well as this. And that's one of the things that happens in our day too. And for purposes of our undergraduate class, I'm going to play a little bit fast and loose with the overlaps. We can isolate things out a lot more, but I think for our purposes, I think we'll continue to go with the broader strokes along the way. There are ways in which what happens once you are part of the community of believers becomes important. We become ourselves the sacrifice by our service. Animal sacrifice in the temple is no longer required. We are going to be grateful to God and grateful to the community, a part of who we are. So we are a group who is growing into God's righteousness, and we are a group who is in fact reflective of that, according to Romans. Thessalonians, when we're talking about Thessalonians, this is a very early letter, and one of the things that was at issue here, the purpose is, well, if we're in around the year 50, then we're at least a decade after Jesus has been crucified and resurrected. Well, that's a long time. People die in 10 years. What's happening? Because people at this point were waiting right away. I mean, they were looking up. Is he coming back now? Is he coming back now? He could come back at any moment. Remember when we talked about the Gospel of Mark? It was so short because Jesus could be back at any moment. You have to hurry and read this book. We don't have a lot of time for extra details. What happens if people have already died? Are they going to be left out? And what happens? Why is it worth even remembering these kinds of things? So he was writing to reassure them in many ways that this was not the case. That when we have the church constituted as a community, those who have died are still part of that, are still part of that community, are still part of that congregation along the way. One of the things that we see in many of the letters, and this one is no different, is reference to other people, often traveling with Paul. Silvanus and Timothy are frequently people who are sort of highlighted in this as when outside historians are looking for the different people who are around. These are two of the people who are often held up. We can see from this work that there is persecution going on. We can see that there is sort of a little bit of encouragement to do the kinds of work that's necessary to sustain the community, and encouragement in the face of people passing away. And once again, just as we had in First Thessalonians. In the second one here, we have, again, continue in faith and work. To sort of reassure them a little later. They're like, well, you said he was coming and he's still not here. So one of the interesting things that I know at least one seminary has as an assignment is there's the first letter, First Thessalonians, and there's the next letter, Second Thessalonians. There was probably a letter from the Thessalonians back to Paul that then got yet another response. We don't have that letter. I know some seminaries and probably some colleges as well have an assignment where you as the student have to write that letter. What would you write in response that would then get Second Thessalonians back? And there's some minor tweaking around. It may be that Second Thessalonians is actually two shorter letters that were put together. So there might have been more than two back and forth. And that would not be unusual in the ancient world. But what we have is we have the idea that people should continue their lives, continue to work with respectable work. One of the things that they should do is that they should, in many ways, see themselves as working towards a better community and building a better community. Corinthians, we have two letters in Corinth as well. And we have factions. We have people who are believing in different kinds of things back and forth. One of the things that happens in the ancient world, and we see this reflected in a couple of different documents along the way, is there were some people who thought, well, I've been saved, I can just do whatever I want now. And that became an issue along the way, as well as different kinds of sort of failure to follow what was becoming by then standard church practices along the way. So we have some church faults, we have some doctrinal faults. One of the things that would never occur to us today, really never occur to us today, is can you eat something that's been sacrificed to another god? One of the things that happened back then was you have different temples for different gods, and they have animal sacrifices. You burn them. In other words, you cook them. What happens to the cooked, burnt stuff? People eat them. Sort of, can Christians eat the sacrifices, the burnt offerings, the cooked meat from something else? Well, if you're a Christian, you know, well, that's a false god. Why not? It's not going to hurt anything. And to a certain extent, the church says, yeah, that's sort of okay. Actually, technically, you're right. But if you're eating that makes people think, well, you're following that temple and you're following that god, then that's probably not the best thing to be doing along the way. We have a second letter that comes to the Corinthians, and we know that this is at least the fourth letter to the Corinthians. So we sometimes are not sure we have everything saved along the way. But one of the things here is to reinforce to that community that Jews and Gentiles are on the same basis in the community, that you don't have a hierarchy of people who, well, you came late into it and we were already here, or we were born into Judaism and became, but you were, it's like, no. So one of the things that we see, that's not really a good way of operating, Paul would say. What we have in a lot of places, including Corinth, is a group called the diaspora. The diaspora are Jewish people who left Jerusalem, left Judea, left the areas of Israel, and formed new communities. Large cities often had these, and they often did their best to hold on to at least some of their practices along the way. There was some assimilation going on, and that's true to this day. There's a wonderful song in a musical called Candide by Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein, as you may guess from the name, himself is of a Jewish heritage. And he wrote a song called I'm So Easily Assimilated. And it was set in sort of late medieval Spain, at least the usual setting for this song is. And there's someone who is in Spain but she's Jewish, and she's singing the song, I'm So Easily Assimilated, as she's wearing the Spanish clothes and speaking the Spanish language and eating the Spanish food. But there are some different things that still hold her out as being of the Jewish religion. One of the things that we see with regards to Corinthians is that we do end up with some rather strong prohibitions that can be somewhat misled or misread, and they're still debated to this day. For example, women being silent in church. We have that coming from Paul, and we have it in somewhat different ways, but we have it more particularly where women should be silent in church. That doesn't work. That doesn't really work in really anything. And it keeps getting reinterpreted and reinterpreted. Right now, it's often interpreted as being women can't be ordained into ministry. One of the problems with that, of course, is that's not what it says. Any biblical literalist who thinks that's what it says is not actually a biblical literalist. What happens, of course, is you go to churches, especially today, especially in the West, including the United States, the majority of people attending are women. And the majority of people are they not supposed to sing? Well, there are actually a very minor number of churches where women don't sing and where women actually sit in a different part. But in large part, that's not true anymore. We don't have that, and women aren't allowed to teach men. Well, how do you define that too? When most of the women are Sunday school teachers, or most Sunday school teachers are women in a lot of churches. So we do have some issues that are in this along the way. But then we have the captivity epistles. Paul was frequently in trouble. He was frequently in jail. When we're looking at the Colossians, there's a place called Colossus, and what we see here is he's writing with regards to orthodoxy, what we believe, and orthopraxy, how we practice. Gnosticism was an issue. We talked a little bit about that, I think, in lecture 1, where what you know. And do you know secret knowledge kinds of things? That becomes an important thing. Do we have to practice? Again, here's that idea. Do we have to practice the Jewish restrictions of diet and circumcision and other kinds of things along the way? Do we practice different kinds of almost fantastical things that are coming to us in terms of what we think the Christian vision is? And as that happens, it tends to divide rather than join together and unify Christians along the way. So in many ways, Paul is looking to overcome this along the way. He wants there to be a group coming together that will include, and as he says elsewhere, neither slave nor free, neither Jew nor Greek, neither male nor female, but all of these things coming together. When we look at the Gnostic ideas, this was not an independent religion necessarily, but a strand that sometimes percolated in a lot of different religions. And one of the problems with Gnosticism is many of the ways in which Gnosticism was done is it was done by secret knowledge, so you had to sort of work your way up in a mystical way that was not at all clear. But it also tended to look at the world as sort of a battle between good and evil. Well, we can see that sometimes, so what's the problem? But it tended to think of the world as being created by evil, not being created by good. So that's contradictory of Genesis. And it tends to think of all material things as evil. Sometimes in Christianity, we tend towards that as well, but that's actually not strictly what's truthful. When we look at Ephesus, again, we're looking at the practices and we're looking at the beliefs along the way. We're looking once again for unity, and we're looking at what we sometimes call spiritual weapons. One of the things he wants you to do is to take on light and let away darkness. So this is in many ways a poetic rendering of what we might do. Here we have in Philemon, the Onesimus, the guy I talked about before. This is a very short letter. Onesimus was a runaway slave. He fled to Rome. He converted to Paul's ministries, or converted to Jesus, but under Paul's ministry. Sorry about that. And what Paul was doing was he was sending him back because his owner was also someone known to Paul. And Paul said, well, the right thing to do is to send him back, but also to send him back as a brother, not a slave. And this is where Paul, as I mentioned before, said, well, I could tell you to free him, but I'm going to leave it to your best judgment. If there's something I would love to do, it's sort of like to find out what happened next. There used to be a Paul Harvey series called The Rest of the Story. I want to know the rest of the story here. One of the things that Paul says, is that Onesimus is a fellow servant. We are all slaves of Christ, whether you're a free man in Roman terms or not, along the way. And when we're looking at Philippians, we're sort of looking at a sort of a go, a rah kind of thing. And this is an encouragement, which is great because Paul was actually under arrest when he was writing this. So we see he's almost being somewhat philosophical about the way things are happening in this. But he talks about joy and grace quite a bit as he's reflecting on what's happening in his life. And we see all of these things that are out there in terms of making his joy complete. That's my favorite phrase from this letter along the way. So I invite you to look at these, but I also want to read for you, as I read for you my favorite story from Acts. I need my glasses because I'm getting older. And I want to read for you my favorite passage from the Pauline letters that we've covered thus far. And it comes from 1 Corinthians, and it is something that I almost always will use when I am doing a funeral service. And when we do our annual memorial services, when I'm I'm chaplain at Beltrace, and we have an annual memorial service for those who have passed away in the year before. And let me read this to you, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about why I always choose this specific passage. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things. It believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I am fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. And the greatest of these is love. Notice a couple of things in that passage. There's not a note of condemnation in the entire thing. There's hardly anything in that passage that you can't relate to, even if you're not a Christian. Did you notice what wasn't referenced in there along the way. It's because Paul is trying very hard to reach out and, as I mentioned before, be all things to all people. And if you're going to be all things to all people, you have to start and you have to finish with love. And you have to start and you have to finish with understanding who we are and in our human frailties. We're known only in part and we know only in part. We see things dimly. And that's what we need to try to overcome, knowing that we never will fully, but through the power of love, the love that never ends, the love that never dies. That's why this is an important passage to me. And that is why Paul is an important person to me. I wanted to tell you two more stories. Forgive me if I sort of scratch my eye here for a moment. I want to tell you in one way about the horse. I mentioned that I was going to mention the horse here. This is Paul being on the road to Damascus to persecute Christians. And he saw something fantastic and heard something fantastic. And it blinded him, literally blinded him. It was so fantastic. And he interpreted this as the power of God and the presence of Jesus directing him to stop persecuting the Christians and to join them. And he became as zealous having joined the Christians as he was a persecutor of them. Now, where does the horse come from? I took a course once in Christian art. And this is one of the things that happens during the Reformation period. When you see a picture like this, if it's done in stained glass or in painting, then I don't know that this particular one was done during that time period. But if you see during the Reformation period a depiction like this with a horse, you can be fairly certain that it was a Catholic artist who did it. If there is no horse, if it's just Paul on the road to Damascus, but there's no horse there, you can be fairly certain that it was a Protestant artist who did it. Because the Protestants at that time were getting what we might call back to basics and tended to be more literal in their interpretation of the Bible. Yes, to take it literally is an interpretation. That is an interpretation choice. That is not what's required of the Bible. And a lot of people, as I mentioned about women not speaking in church, when it says literal, they're like, oh, because thou shalt not kill. Okay, well, the King James Version says kill. It doesn't say thou shalt not murder. But if you're interpreting that literally, then military and police forces and others, that becomes an issue as well. So there are issues on being overly literal, overly locked into literal interpretation. But the artists who were interpreting the conversion story in Acts didn't see a horse mentioned in the text, and it isn't. Didn't see Paul getting knocked off a horse mentioned in the text. So they said, if there's no horse in my text, there's no horse in my painting. On the other hand, the Catholic artists at the time thought in this way, and this is the sort of the sociological way of thinking that's a little bit different. Remember when I was reading that passage about people reading out loud that we don't tend to think of as being natural, but that back then was. Back then, they said, well, Paul's a prominent person. Prominent people travel by horseback. They don't walk. So he must have been knocked off his horse. So here's the horse in the picture. So before then, we didn't have Protestant and Catholic division. After the sort of immediacy of the Reformation, that didn't hold true. And there were Protestants who were painting horses, and there were Catholics who were not along the way. But it was sort of an interesting little thing that popped up that you would have never thought about in terms of how we interpret what we're reading. The other little story I wanted to tell you was in terms of who says the most. If we discount Luke as a speaker or a writer who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, he was mostly writing about other people. In terms of the one person who seems to be the most verbose, the most talkative, and the most in terms of writing letters, that would be Paul. That would be the Apostle Paul. In 1994, I think it was, I got a cat. And a friend of mine had rescued this cat, and it was at a vet, and she was looking for a home for this cat. And I had just purchased a new house and had room and had outdoors with woods and other kinds of things that was distant from a road. So it was like, this could be a good place for a cat. So I went and I found the cat, and the cat sort of meowed and meowed and meowed at me, and I got it finally home, and it meowed, meowed, meowed. And this cat just would never stop talking. This cat said more than every other cat that I had ever had in my life, and I'd only had it for a few weeks. So, of course, its name was Paul, because it said a lot. Thanks for being part of this. I know this lecture is going on a little bit longer, but I apologize for not being there on Tuesday. I'm making one more video. It'll be much shorter, I promise, on the assignments for week 3. Thanks.